Good morning. We are on Mem Gimel Amud Beis 43b. What we've discussed is the verse states, the third anomaly in the verse, which adds the word it. In the context here of the field, the verse says, one who planted a field, which we expanded to mean acquired, bought, received as a gift. So one who got a new field and has not, or a vineyard, and who has not yet redeemed it. That extra it comes to narrow the scope of what is being discussed. But if the person got this field and hasn't redeemed it, right, he hasn't made it to his fourth year in which you can redeem the crop to enjoy, then he goes back, he's exempt from battle, he's exempt from combat, and goes into a maintenance unit of some sort. So the Gemara said, this word it, one who hasn't redeemed it, comes to limit the scope of the kind of field that causes an exemption. And the limitation is that only someone who plants a new field of whatever kind, orchard or vineyard, is exempt from combat unit, but one who's simply grafted one, or if one took the branch and put it back into the ground, I'm not sure what the term for that is. Then, if that's the new kind of field, he's not exempt, stay in the combat unit. To which the Gemara raises a contradiction. Our Mishnah says the reverse. Our Mishnah says that even if a person grafted and his new vineyard is just a whole grafting vineyard, apparently, then he is exempt from battle, from the combat unit. So to resolve this seeming contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa, this is from yesterday. The Gemara said like this: if the person did this, we'll just use the word grafting, but I mean both. If the person did grafting, that's actually the term the Gemara uses, hakavas. If the person grafted in such a fashion that it is permissible under the laws of kilayim, right? There's the laws of kilayim, which is the laws of crossbreeding, prohibition against crossbreeding. So if the grafting was done where they're both of the same species, and therefore it was a permitted act, and his new field is kosher grafted new field or kosher grafted new vineyard, and he's exempt from battle. If, however, he grafted in a fashion that would be forbidden, he violated the rules of crossbreeding in that act of grafting, then even though he has a whole new field, because his acquiring it was done under illegal terms, non-halachic terms, therefore he's not exempt. The exemption from battle does not apply to him. This is where we are at the moment. And this parallels, sorry?
What does it mean by a new field? Because if this is about redemption, that's a way at least to be.
Okay, we're going to get into that. We're going to get into that as well. We're going to get into that. About when the redemption applies in terms of grafting.
All right.
That's what we're going to get into today. Yeah, because that's the precisely right question to be asking.
Right.
Meaning, if he grafted, and the verse says redeemed it, what redemption is necessary? Is it considered a new field at all? Do the rules of Arla apply?
Right.
Do the rules of the Torah apply? That's what we're going to discuss today. But at the moment, as we establish it, it's parallel to the Gemara's statement about the new house. If you stole a new house, even though you paid for it and you did teshuvah, and now it's your new home, halachically belongs to you, but because you acquired it in a fashion that the halacha does not allow, the exemption is not applied. So likewise here, the person grafted a field under illegal terms. He violated the prohibitions of kilayim. So even though it's a whole new field, and he doesn't have to rip it up, presumably, even though there are times when you have to, but let's just say he doesn't have to. Nonetheless, because this field is acquired to him illegally because he violated kilayim, the exemption is not applied. That's what we are now. So now the Gemara is going to address Robert's question, which is, what exactly is the nature of this kosher grafting for which these laws would apply? That's what the Gemara is about to discuss at the moment. Yeah? Are you with me? Okay. So it's somewhere about less than a third from the top of the page. The line begins with the word heter, and the second word is high. You see it?
Yeah.
Okay. High harkovas heter. This permissible grafting, which we say is warrants this exemption from a combat unit. Heichidami. What are the circumstances? How does it work? Ilema, should you suggest Yalda be Yalda? He has Yalda literally means a child. It means like a fresh new vineyard in which he grafts fresh new branches. Or saplings. I think that's the right term. But saplings belongs to a tree, not a vineyard. Or does it apply also to vineyard? Whatever. A sapling, a fresh new vineyard being grafted into a fresh new vineyard. Then you don't need a special exemption here, because typically you can derive the boy mahader that he returns from the battlefield because he's exempt from combat unit, mishum yalda rishoina, because of the first sapling. In other words, if he has a fresh new vineyard and he grafted another fresh new vineyard into it, the reason why he's exempt from battlefield is not because he grafted, but because the first one is already fresh. Right? We have to find the case in which the grafting itself is giving you the exemption. That's the whole point here. There's a special law being told, the Mishnah tells us, that even if you grafted a field, but the grafting, so long as the grafting was done in such a way that it's kosher, you're exempt from battle. If what you're grafting into, the graftee, I'm not sure if that's the right term, but if what you're grafting into is itself a new field, then that itself warrants the exemption. The grafting is not what gives you the exemption. Okay? So the Allah, therefore, rather, we have to say like this. The field itself doesn't. You with me, Robert? Or...
I'm trying to understand.
So pause me for not, because I'm going to build on top.
Keep going.
Yeah? Yeah, we're building, it's going to keep on building on top of each other. So if we're missing the first step, we have to get it straight, yeah? Right? So let's just play it out.
The grafting is not the rule in which you learn whether or not it's
right, it's not a trigger. The grafting is not the reason for my exemption.
Right.
The original field would be if the original field itself is new, then the grafting is not why I'm exempted from combat. It's the original field that exempts you from combat units. So therefore, we have to conclude then, Ella rather, Yalda, the vineyard that's being put in is new, Biskena into a branch that's old. So I have a vineyard that's 10 years old, so I've been enjoying it for years already, and I grafted into it something new. So the original field in which I'm grafting does not exempt me from battlefield because I've been enjoying it for 10 years. Mm-hmm. It's the new one that's fresh. That's why I'm being exempt. Yeah? Presumably that would be the way to explain how the grafting is given me the exemption rather than the old field, because the old field is old. Yeah? It says the Gemara, this is to your point. But Rabbi Abo told us that Yalda, a fresh sapling, a new young vine, shesibcha biskena, that was wedged into an old vine, batla Yalda bizikena. The new branch is nullified and takes on the laws of the old one, the ein din arla, and does not have the law of arla. And like you said, our mission, our verse says that if you have a vineyard and you haven't yet redeemed it, then you stay home from the battlefield. Redemption is in the fourth year after 3 years of arla. The 4 years are always applied together. Any field that doesn't have the law of arla doesn't have netter devai, doesn't have the law of the fourth year. Right? The first 3 years when you can't enjoy of your field, the fourth year when you have to redeem. Our verse is talking about that fourth year when you have to redeem. Yeah. The halach has been established that if you have an old vineyard, you've been enjoying it for 10 years already. You already did your 3 years of arla, and you did your netter devai, and now you've been enjoying it. And now you grafted a sapling into it, and now the sapling grows. The sapling, even though it's a day old, takes on the laws of your old field. And therefore, no arla is applied, no fourth year is applied, and therefore the whole verse doesn't apply either. So we're stuck in this conundrum. When exactly does the grafting give you an exemption? If it's a new field to begin with, then you're exempt from the new field, not the grafting. And if the original field is an old one, then the new sapling takes on the law of the old one, in which case you shouldn't be exempted either. So when does the grafting give us an exemption? We're stuck in this quandary. Following? Yeah, we're with me on the catch-22 here. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's straightforward, but it's just fun.
Yes, Rabbi.
Yeah, okay. Rabbi Yirmiyah, one shouldn't call Gemara fun, but it's enjoyable nonetheless. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, La'olam, literally translated La'olam means forever, but colloquially you would translate it as actually. So in reality or in actuality, Yalda b'Yalda, we are discussing a new vine being planted into a new vine, grafted into a new vine. Okay, well, as for your question as to, well, I'm exempted already from the old vine or from the old new one, the one that's in the field, because it's new, right?
Mhm.
Why does the grafting exempt me? Seemingly the original field exempts me, right? So explains the Gemara Kagoin, and this works out. The Nota Lahach Kamaisa, he planted that original one, Lisyog Ulakotis, as a boundary and for a wall. So he planted his first vineyard a month ago, but his intention in doing so was not to yield crops. The intention was to create a boundary around his property, say. So he built this vine all around. You see it all the time. People have trees, hedges as their borders, as their boundaries, or kodesh also could mean that he planted it because he wants to use the wood, not for the crops, but he wants to yield the wood and sell that. Either way, he didn't plant it for the yield of produce. So because he didn't plant it for the yield of produce, the law of Arla doesn't apply. The law of Arla doesn't apply because it's not a fruit trees. Yeah, even with the fruit trees, because he's not maintaining it, he's not enjoying it. It's just left for, and whatever you take, you don't take. It's an irrelevant factor. You're not going to sit there spraying the grapes or doing all the other things you would do to maintain the crop, the yield crop. Maybe even planted one of those kind of vines that, or they do sometimes. I have in my backyard. My kids found vines that make these tiny little grapes. They're actually edible. We Googled it. They're actually edible. They have a strange taste, but they don't produce them every year. Sometimes they arrive, sometimes they don't arrive. I suppose if I maintained them, maybe they would grow every year, but they're part of the hedges in the back, right? Exactly. So it's not like planted with this intention, with all the necessary components of producing the produce. So he did it either for a border of his boundary of his property or for the wood, right? He wants to sell it to make wicker baskets. I don't know, whatever the.
Are you considering the proper formation that?
Yeah, so elsewhere the Gemara discusses how we determine what your intention was. How we determine that.
So it's the other way.
Yeah, but the point is that was his intention when he originally planted the first one. So that field, even though it's a month old, or that vine does not exempt you from battlefield, nor does it get the law of Arla. But now I grafted into that vine another vine, and this grafted one I do intend for the yielding of fruit. So I have a vine for my property border, let's say, and then I grow out of that lines of vineyards for the actual grape that I'm going to be harvesting. So that exempts me from battle. So it's not the old one, not the old new one or the original one, but the new one that's exempting me, the grafted one.
It's not assuming the old status. It's forming its
But
own new
sorry,
status.
it's not assuming the old status, it's forming its new one. Because they're different intention. They're different intention. The Gemara is actually going to discuss why here you have separate laws, even though they're into each other, whereas the other one, the new and the old, the new one takes on the halach of the old. We'll discuss that as well. But so you're on target today. Very good. You're asking the right question. It means you understand it. It's good. Okay. So now the Gemara establishes how indeed, or cites to the text that supports this notion that when you have a vineyard that you've planted with the intention of creating a boundary or just for the wood, then you're indeed exempt from Arla. The Tanan, for we've learned in the Mishnah, Hanoit Elisyog, one who plants a vineyard for the sake of a border or boundary, the Lakodos, and for the beams of wood, Potim in Arla. It is exempt from the law of Arla. And if it's exempt from the law of Arla, this does not warrant a exemption from battlefield, because the verse states explicitly that the exemption is because you haven't redeemed it yet. There is no redemption of this field you planted for the wood or for the border, and therefore the exemption comes now because I have grafted into that one a produce yielding vine, which an arla compliant yielding fruit yielding vine, and thus there's this exemption from the grafting, but not from the original one. So the Gemara now asks, what's the difference between the new vine that I graft into an old vine, in which we say that the new vine takes on the status of the old one and thus exempted from arla because the old one already did arla years earlier? The butler, in which case, as we just stated, the new vine is nullified and therefore assumes the status of the old vine. Umayshna, why is that different? Yalda biyalda, where the new one, which I intended to yield crop, that's implanted into another new one, which was intended for the border, the loy butla, in which case it's not nullified. Why is that? Following the question? We're saying, are you with me on the question here? Yeah, with me in the question? Okay. So what's the distinction? Says the Gemara, Hassam, over there, in the case of the nullifying version, in which you planted a new vine into an old vine, and the new vine takes on the status of the old vine. The reason is because the old vine is set in its status and cannot change. In mimlachala, if you decide to change your mind about that vine, la bas bahadar, you can't take it back. In other words, this old vine, which you've yielded crops for how many years it was, right? You cannot now say, okay, no, it's no longer a vine. I'm only using it from now on for border or for the wood, and now it changes halachic status. I can't. The old one is stuck in its fixture, halachic fixture. And if when I graft a new one in it, it assumes the status of the old, because the old one is stuck and fixed in its status. Hacha, following? But here, in the case of the new vine, which I intended to yield crops, which I put into the original new vine, which I intended for the border or for the wood. If I change my mind about it, bas mahaderhi, I could change my mind about it. Because to begin with, vines are meant to yield fruit. I decided not to. I went against its nature. So let's just, like this. If I planted a vineyard for a border, I planted this long vineyard around the border of my property, right? And my intention was the border of my property. So did I use it for its natural use? No, I imposed a change upon it. Okay, so I'm exempt from the laws of Arla because I did it with a different intention. And 1 to 5 months in, I decided, you know what? It's really producing nice grapes. So I'm going to start harvesting. So what happens? Am I exempt from Arla? No, you are not exempt from Arla. And if you switch your mind about that old,
then Arla kicks in.
Arla kicks in. So because to begin with, this original planting is not completely detached from Arla. It's only
dormant.
It's been dormantly removed from the law of Arla because I imposed another status upon it. It's conditional.
Based on intent.
Based on my intent. And therefore, when I take the new one and graft it in, why should this new one take on the imposed intent on the old one, which is against its nature?
It's natural nature.
It's not, it's right. So therefore, the new grafted doesn't take on the law of the original grafted. The original grafted remains in its temporary exemption because I decided I'm not producing any fruit out of it. And the new one keeps the Arla status because it's doing what it's supposed to do, which is produce fruit. But when I put the new one into an old one, the old one is fixed as an Arla producing tree, which went through its Arla years ago, but it stays in its original state. And I'm attaching a natural yielding fruit into another natural yielding fruit vine. And thus it takes on the status of the one into which I grafted. Clear on the distinction? Yeah. Says the Gemara, support. Mididahava, this will follow the way it would be in regard to fruit that was produced on its own without my intent. Sorry for those watching. I just scrolled down to get Rashi and refresh to get clarity in the page. Okay, the Tanan, for we looked at the Mishnah. If I have a vine, and to begin with, I had no intention of producing fruit, and now all of a sudden fruits are producing. So I'm collecting them, I'm harvesting them. Yeah?
So, okay,
This is what you were asking. Says the Mishnah, Chayav Ba'arla, you're obligated in Arla.
even if you didn't harvest it, or only if you harvest?
Well, if I'm not harvesting it, then I'm not harvesting it.
Yeah.
But if I'm starting to harvest it,
then
so even though when I originally planted it, I didn't have any intent of harvesting, but clearly I'm harvesting it. So clearly my intent is I like these fruits.
Right.
Okay, so Arla applies to you, which indicates from the very fact that the Mishnah states that even though you weren't expecting the fruit, but if the fruit came, you now are obligated in Arla, is the Mishnah's way of saying that really these vines do, Arla does apply to it. It just so happens that you impose your intention upon it, and therefore you're exempt from Arla. But the moment you indicate that your intention is undone, Arla comes right back. So if it happens to produce fruit, even though you didn't do anything to make that happen, and you had no intention, but now that it's here and you're harvesting it, Arla applies.
If we leave it follow, though, the whole doesn't apply.
If you don't touch it, you're not touching it anyway, so you're not violating it anyway. What's the difference? But as soon as you start harvesting it, look, you want them, good, halacha applies. So which means, therefore, that if I have a new vineyard, even though I'm exempt temporarily because I decided to use it as a boundary, but that is not enough to impose upon the vine that I graft into it, that it too should be exempt from Arla. Because the exemption of the original one isn't a real exemption. It's only exemption conditional to my interest, to my lack of interest in the fruit. But as soon as I graft something in, then that does apply Arla, because I'm interested in the fruit. And therefore, back to the original point, which is that if I graft a vine with the intention of yielding fruit and harvesting fruit
First case.
into a vine that is new, but I had no intention of grafting fruit, then the reason why I'm exempt from battle is because of the grafted one. Because the original one remains an exemption. But the new grafted one does not remain an exemption. I am obligated in Arla. And therefore that new one is why I'm exempt from battle, even though it's only grafted. This is the whole exercise to get to that point. Well then, so the original Mishnah, our Mishnah, which gave us an exemption and said that even one who grafted a field is exempt from combat unit. Under what's the circumstance in which the Mishnah says you get this exemption? Answer: when you planted one field with the intention of using the wood or making a boundary, for which you are exempt from Arla. And because you're exempt from Arla, that field would not exempt you from combat.
Right.
But then into that you grafted something in which you are intending to harvest fruit, and therefore you are obligated in Arla, and therefore you haven't redeemed it yet, and therefore you're exempt. And the reason why it doesn't take on the status of the original one into which it's grafted, which is exempt, is because that original exemption isn't a real exemption. It's only because you've imposed your intention on it.
So the first case, he was exempt, right?
The first case in which he grafted into the old one, you're talking
The
about?
new one would be nullified into the old.
That's right.
Where he already did Orla.
That's correct. And therefore, no exemption.
No exemption.
That's correct.
Yeah,
So in the first case,
Yeah.
where I put the new one into the old one, the new one takes on the status of the old one. And because the old one, I've already paid off my Arla, and therefore that wouldn't be exempting me from battlefield. So to the grafting doesn't exempt me from battlefield either. But it's an extension of the old. It's an extension of the old. Extension of
the same.
the grafting is the same. Yeah. Yeah.
What the status was.
What's the halachic status of each of these fields? Correct. Yeah, we clear. Judge, you want to say something?
Yes, it's a marvelous, Rabbi, because it has a few principles that are so significant. First of all, enjoying the fruits of one's labor, but at the same time, the whole idea here of that which may arise from that, from an intention that may have been so subtle even, or even that was just meant to be, but wanting to, with God's help, to preserve life to such a degree that one enjoys the fruits of one's labor, and God forbid one shouldn't be lost in a field of battle before one will have enjoyed that in the same way that the married person enjoys his first year with his wife, or as such.
Yeah, indeed. And actually, as you're speaking, it triggered this thought in my head. So, you talk about it was in Yom Yom recently. The daily thought was in there recently. As ma'akat mazeit that when a person plants and sows, one yields produce. That when a person works hard to invest in his spiritual field, he yields results later, right? So the law of grafting then, or the act of grafting spiritually, would be where you're building your spirituality on a previous achievement, right? So when does your new grafting get its own credit? Because that was a new investment in some spiritual movement. And when doesn't it get credit? Right? If there's already an old achievement and all you're doing is extending upon your old achievement, so that's just an extension of your old achievement. It doesn't get its own set of laws of Arla.
Modified into the old.
That's right. But how'd you do it? How'd you do this new achievement? You didn't do it on, it's not an extension of an old achievement. It's built on an old achievement, but it has its own independent thing. There's a novel element. How's that? Because the original one wasn't there to yield fruit. So what was it for? It was for beams or a boundary. It was there to protect you. In other words, my first investment was to say no to negativity. And on that, I decided to say yes to positivity. I created a field that does produce fruit. And then it got its own credit. Because even though they work together, even though saying no to negativity supports my yes to spirituality, but the yes to spirituality has its own value. Because it isn't the direct extension of the old one, even though it's somewhat connected, because my yes to spiritual growth is certainly built on my no to negative. But if all I'm doing is I have a bunch of yes to positivity, I built an old field, and now I'm extending, say yes to more spiritual height. Okay, so you went another step. Is it a radical change? It's not so radical. You've been building spiritually over years, and you added another layer. Good. Can't call that a radical change to give it its own laws of Arla with its own exemption from battle and so on and so forth. It only gets its own exemption. It only gets its own status when it's built on, when it's a novel change, when there's a radical change. Originally, I began with saying no to negativity. I put up beams. I created walls and I put up a fence. And then on top of that, no to negativity, I started to invest in creating yes. And that yes is a radical change. It gets its own laws of Arla, gets its own laws, its own exemption from battle. I don't know what, somehow that thought was triggered in my head as you were speaking, Judge.
Very beautiful. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay. Okay, we're going to stop over here, because what the Gemara is going to do tomorrow is another, shall we say, enjoyable exercise in the mind. What we're going to do is like this. The Gemara is going to suggest another way of understanding the Mishnah, which gives us an exemption for grafting. And what the Gemara is going to do is, well, if you're not choosing that example, then maybe the law is different. So the Gemara is going to deduce, by omission of today's discussion, a law about a different case. Because if you didn't use this as an example, certainly you must be of the opinion that the law is differently. So the Gemara is going to end up analyzing that set of laws to see it, built on the fact that we didn't use it as an example for exemption. Okay, wonderful day, Yin.
All the very best to you, Rabbi. If you have a moment, I'll share something with you.
Sure, just 1 minute.
You can, if you put,